Hello everyone and welcome back. I know it's been a couple months since we've done a live stream. We were pretty busy during the summer months. In fact, I'm going solo on the live stream today. Angelo is actually helping out in Las Vegas at the BattleBots competitions. He's helping manufacture broken and replacement parts. So I might not be able to do questions as much this time, but I will try and save some time at the end to kind of scroll through and if you have a question, maybe put like 3 stars or asterisks next to it or something like that, just so I can kind of see in the chat what's a question and what's just a hello from Germany or whatever. So yeah, so it's been a busy last couple months. I apologize that we haven't been doing live streams, but a lot of my team was on sabbatical or on vacation. In fact, I ended up driving literally across the United States within 90 days. In fact, we did 4,500 miles in 8 days while I was working remotely. So it was kind of crazy, kind of hectic. So now that it's September, we're wanting to start these Thursday live streams again. And today's topic is actually kind of based off of a really cool project that I saw online called Chromance. And it's from Zack Freedman, I think is the correct name. And we're going to talk about how to design like this 3D printed part. And then there's another part that's very similar to it. That's used to hang it, and I'll actually show you. I've always wanted to have like an LED wall, so I apologize for the camera moving here. But you can kind of see this is that LED wall, and you can see it moves. In fact, it even like syncs to audio and all that kind of stuff. So I can do some pretty neat things with it. So I've always wanted to have one of these. In fact, I usually have it just sitting there almost like breathing, so it's kind of calming and relaxing. And where all those metal pieces that hold the LED strips connect, they connect into this guy. And so I'm going to show how would we go about designing something like this, and then how do we go about creating a part that's very similar to it but has some changes to it. And that's where we're going to talk a little bit about the Derive functionality. So let's go ahead and dive right in. I did link the Chromance that this is based off of, the link on YouTube. It's in the description of this live stream. If you want to see what he did with it, it's actually pretty cool. Okay, so I'm going to start making sure I'm in millimeters, and like you should always do, I would recommend creating components. So I'm going to say new component, and I'm just going to call this one mount. So now I have an active component. Allows me to create a sketch, and I'm going to show some tips and tricks as we go through. That's kind of what I'm famous for, that might speed up and save some time for you. So I would need to create like a polygon or a hexagon. So you can see right here, polygon, circumscribed polygon. And what this allows me to do, I'm going to go ahead and click right here in the center. You can kind of see this number 6 right here. So it allows you to specify the number of sides. So for example, here's a triangle, but I'll go ahead and put it back to 6. And I'm going to get the top line sort of horizontal, but not quite. I'm just going to kind of get it like so. But what I do care about is the overall radius of this. So I'm going to say I want that to be 25. I'll hit enter. Now you'll notice it is not fully constrained, but as soon as I come in here and say let's make that a horizontal line, it is now fully constrained. Okay, so here's one of the tips. I'm going to actually extrude in 2 different directions. In fact, I'll move this in case some of the video stuff is covering it up. By default, it's usually set to one side. I'm going to come in here and say 2 sides. And what this allows me to do is I can drag down, for example, and we can see that there's that distance right there. And then I can also drag up. Now, why am I doing this? Well, it's going to keep my origin where this blue plane is. And that's going to make it much easier when I go to kind of create the profiles for the metal inserts. So I want to go down 5 millimeters. And I want to go up, I think, around 28 millimeters. I did create an outline for this. It's linked in the description of the live stream if you want to download this and do it yourself later on. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK. And we now have the component called mount with its own body and its sketches. Or sketch, I should say, right now. So now what we're going to do is start creating the grooves, and it's kind of hard to see. I might be able to zoom up on it. There's some, yeah, it's a little hard to focus on, but there's some grooves in here, kind of a particular profile that the metal, and I don't have a spare piece, I wish I did, kind of slides in and gets held in place. And you might be thinking, how would you go about creating these little standoffs or these little arms? Okay, so I'm going to, using the cube kind of as reference, I want to create a sketch on this front face. So I'll pre-select it, create my sketch, zoom up here just a little bit, and here you can kind of see why I did that extrude in two different directions. Notice where my origin is, and we're basically going to create all of the stuff above this, and I have enough material down here you know, for this stability of the part. So I'm going to create a line, and hopefully you all know this. We recently added a new line type in here called center line. So I'm going to do center line. I'm just going to click at the origin and drag straight up, like so. Then I might create another line, but this time I'm going to do just a construction line. So I'm just going to create a construction line that goes across. That way I can kind of reference that line if necessary. Then I'm just going to kind of mock up what the groove is supposed to look like. So I'm going to, and again in the outline, I basically, oops, and I want to make sure I'm in the real line. I give like the shape of the profile, and that's kind of what I'm following here. It's just something that kind of looks like that. This is kind of the opening. Then I'm going to start to create the dimensions for this to tie it down, because right now you can see that it is not fully constrained. So I'll throw a dimension maybe here, and that's supposed to be 3. Maybe I'll throw a dimension from here to here, and that is supposed to be 0.8, I think. I need to throw my glasses on here. I'm looking at my my outline real quick. Yeah, 0.8. So we'll do that guy. And you can see as I'm starting to do these dimensions, it starts to constrain the sketch. So 6.25. And then finally this little length right here is going to be 2.4. And again, these are millimeters, so they're fairly small measurements. So I get that particular shape, and you can kind of see that's, let me line things up, that's kind of that angle right there, and then the vertical line going up and down. Okay, so that's kind of what we just created. Then I'm also going to use this sketch to create the slot for the metal that's going to be slid into here or held into here. So here's a cool, actually I think I'll get to that here in just a second. I'm going to draw a profile here. And here's a cool tip. So notice I have these dimensions here, and I also have these constraints. I can come over here and turn off show dimensions and show constraints, and it kind of cleans up what this is going to look like. So it's not so cluttered as when I had all this stuff on here. And we'll come back to that here in a second. But now I'm going to draw another profile, just kind of mocking it up. So I'll come over here, draw vertically a little bit, kind of come at some weird angle. Again, just kind of guesstimating what this is going to look like. Let me purposely make some changes here. I'll do that, and I'll do something like that. Okay, so you can see some of it is constrained and some of it is not. What I'm going to do now is use dimensions and constraints. So I want these two lines, this line here and this line here to be lined up with each other. So I'm going to make those collinear. So I'm going to say that line and that line need to be collinear with each other. I want this line and this line to be parallel with each other, so they're pointing in the same direction. And then I can tie down with some dimensions. So I'll go ahead and hit the show dimensions again here real quick. Type in some of these dimensions. So let me go ahead and type in like 3.5 for this guy, and you can see how that changes slightly. We'll do, dimension 1.2. I'll make this angle 135. So I'm just kind of tying down everything, fully kind of constraining it, so you can kind of see how that updated that one there. We'll make this 0.4. So the only thing that's left is this blue line right here. And again, here's a tip. If you don't know why it's unconstrained, I just click and drag and I can see, oh, it doesn't know the height of that line, because I can move that line up and down. So let's throw a dimension from maybe here down to the very bottom, and we'll make that 7 millimeters in this case. So now we've kind of tied a bunch of this down. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that looks good. That looks good. Okay. I want to add one more dimension. I'm going to go from here to here and do 1.2. Okay, there we go. That looks a little bit more what I was looking for. But notice how crowded and complicated that whole thing looks. And this is where I turn these guys on and off. They didn't go away, they're just like hidden. And I can see this profile much better than when it looks like that. So hopefully you guys know that tip. Now I want to mirror this to the other side, and this is one of those tips that I did earlier. I created this as a center line, so watch what happens when I do my mirror. Notice it says mirror line 1 selected. It automatically selected that for me, so all I have to do is draw a box around what do I want to mirror, and that's that geometry right there, and I'll say OK. And it automatically mirrored for me. Now I could, if this was a construction line, I would have had to have said, this is my mirror line. Okay. Looks like I have somebody helping out on chat. I really appreciate that. Maybe, hopefully it's Jason. So if you have any questions, whoever's on chat will hopefully help you out. So thank you. Okay. So Stuart asked a question I just glanced over. Why was the profile black? Yep, it is Jason. Woohoo, yay. Why is the profile black before I added that last dimension? And I'm not going to undo, but it was because of this line down here. It wasn't fully constrained. I hadn't given that a dimension yet, but because this line was on top of it, it looked black. So once I put this dimension in here, this 1.2, that's when it fully constrained the sketch. And if I take a look, let's say, okay, let me go finish sketch. And now I have this profile, and I could have done it as 2 separate sketches, but basically because it's on the same face, I created it as one single sketch. So I'm going to select the profiles that I want to extrude. So I'm going to grab these, right click, and it shows me the command that makes sense. So I'll say extrude. We'll drag backwards a little bit to kind of give it the direction that we want. And then I can specify how far. And in this case, I can see it's a negative number, so I'm going to type in minus 10 millimeters in this case. I'll say OK. And we've kind of created this particular shape. Well, I want to reuse my sketch, and by default, it gets turned off, which is a preference. You can go into your preferences and say, do not turn off my sketches, but it just kind of helps clean things up. Typically you're only using a sketch once, so that's why we have it set that way by default, but I can always come back and turn that sketch back on. Now I want to remove a lot more material, so there's a lot of room. So I'm going to come in here and grab these profiles again, just these two, right mouse click and say extrude. Now I want it to go exactly halfway into the model, or basically to the center, but I don't have a point there. But check this out. If I change, instead of distance, I can come in here and say to object. And usually when we say to object, we're like clicking on a face of a single part or another part, but I can actually come over here and click on this point, and it's going to extrude back to that point. So you can kind of see how that's lined up. So I'm basically specifying that as my distance. So it's always going to go to the center of this polygon, or hexagon I should say, sorry. And I'll say okay. I'll turn my sketch off just to kind of keep things looking nice. And there, in just, basically 2 sketches, I now have an area for the metal to slide in and stop against, and then I have this big void. Okay, here is where some forward thinking comes in. So in this example here, it has, like 6 arms. Well, what if I wanted it to have 3 arms or 4 arms or something like that? Well, this is where I'm going to create a variable or a parameter. So I'm going to come in here and say change parameters. And what this is showing me is right now I have model parameters, and that's it. If I expand this open, I can see, for example, let's just do this first extrude. We can see those 2 distances that I specified, the 28 and the 5 and all that kind of stuff. I could expand open these sketches and see all the dimensions of these sketches. But what I'm going to do is actually create what's called a user parameter. So I'm going to come in here and let's just call this number of slots. So I'm going to say like number of slots. Now it's not a measurement, it's like a number. So I'm going to come in here and say no unit. And I'm just going to scroll through here so you can see we've got a ton of different units in here. So angles, currency, mass, percentage. I mean, there's just a ton in here that you could use. But I'm going to say no unit, and let's just default to 6. And I'll say OK. And I now have a user parameter. In fact, I could say this is one of my favorites. I'm going to click on that little star, and you can see it kind of puts it up in my favorite. So when we go to do like a pattern, for example, we're going to reference that. So this is kind of where the magic happens. Instead of having to type in or change or whatever, I'm going to come in here and do create pattern, circular pattern. Now, by default, it says faces. Please don't do that. You think about how many faces I would have to manually select. Instead, I'm going to go to features. What are the features? Well, I want that first extrude that I did, and then I'm also going to select that second extrude that I did. And so you can see it selected all of the faces of those 2 extrudes. I'm going to turn my origin on just so I can kind of see that real quick. It's kind of hidden back in there. What's the axis? I'll go ahead and click on that vertical axis. And you can see it kind of gives me a preview of what that would look like. Now this is an enhancement that was put into the product fairly recently. I don't know if you remember, the previews used to be like 1 or 2 faces, kind of showed you what it's going to look like. Well, now we do this really cool wireframe preview. I absolutely love it. So I'm really excited about that update. Okay, so we want it to go all the way around, and notice the quantity says 3. Well, instead of typing in 6 or 4, I'm going to type in number of slots. And notice as soon as I start typing in, the letters, it finds that variable, that user parameter. So I'm going to go ahead and click on there. We can see that that's a parameter, and the preview updates. I'm going to change the compute option to optimized and say OK, and notice the result that we get. Now I'm going to undo just so you can kind of see what happens, but literally in just a couple extrudes and a pattern, we created this shape. So we used a pretty large profile here to kind of extrude into the middle, and because we patterned that around, it basically removed all of that geometry. Okay, the next thing I want to do is put some fillets on here. So I'm going to select an edge, say fillet, and let's just go ahead. I'm going to do both of these fillets here, and I want those to be fairly small. I think 1 millimeter, so you can kind of see how that's rounded over. And since I'm working on kind of the same arms, I'm going to go ahead and add a selection set. So I'm going to click on that little plus. It's going to allow me to select 2 other edges, or multiple edges, I should say. And let's make these a little bit larger. Let's make these 5 in this case, so we can kind of see what we've done there. Now, I could have clicked on all of these edges all the way around. That's totally valid. But I'm curious, can we do a pattern, another pattern of just the fillets? So let's try that. I'm going to do a circular pattern. Again, making sure it says features. And I'm going to select just this fillet feature right here. What's the axis? We'll do that same axis. Instead of the quantity, I'm going to do my parameter, the number of slots. Gives me a nice preview of what that's going to look like. Make sure that says optimize, and I'll say OK. And it's going to pattern those fillets all the way around. So instead of me having to manually click and select those edges. Now, why did I do the parameter? Well, check this out. I'm going to go into change parameters. I'll kind of move this a little bit smaller so you can kind of see. Here's my user parameter. So let's say instead of 6, I want to do 4. I'll click somewhere here. And notice the result I got. Now, I did get a little bit of a warning, and we'll explain that here in a second. But I now have 4 slots. And the fillets still go all the way around. But you'll notice, for example, it didn't do this edge and that edge there. And that's why it gave me the little warning right there. Because that geometry really didn't exist previously. But notice it did a pretty darn good job. It did all of those. I could even come in here and do, for example, like 3. And I get the internal fillets and the external fillets also, and I now have 3 slots. So very quickly I could come in and make changes to this, and it's going to drive what it's going to look like on the model. I think parameters are kind of underutilized. I would highly recommend playing around with them and trying different things. How could I speed up something? For example, if I were creating a bookcase, I would create a parameter called plywood, and I would, let's just say it's 0.75. Then whenever I create a dado or I'm doing an extrusion of the plywood, I would just type in ply, and then my dados are going to be 0.75, the plywood's going to be 0.75, and then let's say I go and I buy the wood and I bring it back, but when I measure it, it's 0.77 instead of 0.75. All I'd have to do is go in and say plywood is now 0.77, whoosh, everything updates. Extremely powerful. Okay, so we are done with this mount, believe it or not. It was literally that quick to create this. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm just going to call it mount. Say OK. Now what I want to do is start to create the other shape, which is this. Let me change my camera here real quick. That's this one here. So we can see it has, some of those arms, those little slots, but instead it's got this area here that you can use to hang it on the wall. So you put it on a nail and then it hangs down on the wall. So I'm going to use a command called Derive. So under the Create menu, you'll see this little icon, Derive. I'll go ahead and click on it. I'm going to move this menu. So when you click on Derive, you get this menu here, and you'll notice a lot of options. So I'm going to just kind of highlight here. So destination, new design, or existing design. Well, this right here is our design. I'm basically going to say new design because I want to kind of work in it in a total new design, so I'm going to leave it there. And then we have the option to derive objects or derive the component. Now I'll talk about this derive objects a little bit more later, but you can derive individual things, even sketches, for example. So that's where I would use derive objects. I'm going to say let's derive the component. I'm going to do this top level mount right here. So it's going to, you can see it, put it in here, and if I expand that open, it's going to derive the bodies, and it's going to derive the sketches that were used. Okay. Then down here there's parameters. Oh, and by the way, I could derive multiple parts if I needed to. But here, parameters. I want to keep the favorites, and I'm going to grab the parameters from the components. Now we're going to talk about this a little bit more later. I'll go ahead and say OK, and watch what happens. I now have a new session that I'm working in. It's untitled. It looks exactly like this original mount over here. Okay. Now there's some pros and cons with Derive, and let me show you. Oh yeah, let me show you. Sorry, let me show you the timeline. Notice I have one feature, and it says derived from mount. So you can kind of think of a derived part as the first part is kind of the master. If you make a change to that, that change is going to roll down to your derived part. So we can make changes to the derived part, but we can't say, okay, make this 3 arms or make it 10 arms or anything like that. You're going to see that. I'm going to show that here in just an example. So you can think of a derived part as almost like a casting. So you've designed this model, it's got fillets and stuff like that. Then you derive that, and you can do like some machining, like we're going to flatten this top face, we're going to drill a hole, etc. If you went back to the casting and made a change to that, your derived part is also going to change. And that's kind of the benefit of the derive functionality. So here's this new one here, and I want to change it. So I don't have, as you can see, I don't have the history tree or the timeline on going back and making changes because it's based off that derived model. But I can use functionality like direct editing or something like that. So I'm just going to draw a box kind of like so, and it's going to select all of this stuff. Now there's some things I don't want to get rid of, so I'm going to unselect, for example, these faces. Now why do that? Well, instead of me manually clicking every single face, I created a fairly large selection set, and then I'm just removing the few features that I want to keep. So you can kind of see I basically just drew a big box around the whole thing, selected a bunch of faces, and then I'm saying keep this outside profile, keep these little arms. Now when I come in here and say delete, you'll see whoosh, it healed that geometry, and I still have these 3 slots right here. And this is based off the original mount, and you're going to see an example of that here in a second. Notice it's also capturing what I did in the timeline. So everything I do now is being captured. Okay. I want to add some geometry on here, so I'm going to just create a quick sketch. And I want to basically have a rounded section right here for the keyhole. I could draw a circle, but these faces are angled, which kind of adds a little bit of complexity to this. So check out, I'm just going to do something like this. So you can kind of see I'm going to create a line, get near this edge, it's going to be coincident with that edge. And then I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm just going to sort of mock this up. I'm going to get near this edge right here. It's going to be coincident with that edge. Well, I want those to be perfectly lined up, so I'm going to do a midpoint constraint. I'm going to say that point is on the middle of that line, and you can see how it moved it over. Same thing here. That point is on the middle of that line, and you can see how it kind of moved that whole point over. So I'm starting to tie down my sketch here. And then I want these to come off at exactly 90 degrees. So I'll say perpendicular. I want that line and that line to be perpendicular with each other. That line and that line to be perpendicular with each other. And now you can see I have this perfect triangle here. And notice it's going back to this back edge. That's kind of important here. Now, could I put my fillet on here as a sketch? I absolutely could, but I like to do things in 3D instead of 2D. I like to keep my sketches simple. So I'm going to grab my profile and say extrude. Now if I start to drag, you're going to see it's going to want to cut or remove this geometry. Well, I don't want it to cut, I want to join. So now it's going to add that geometry. And because this wall's tapered, it doesn't matter, because it's going to always stay touching that wall. And instead of a distance, I'm going to say let's go to a particular object, which is the floor right here. And I get that result. And it's joined like so. And then all I need to do is add in the fillet or fillets that I want. So I'll click this front edge, and notice it's like overhanging and all that kind of stuff. This is what blows me away with Fusion, just how powerful it is. I'm going to start to drag, and you're going to see it's going to allow me to create that fillet, even though, you know, it was kind of overhanging this other edge there. And now we're bringing that point back. So in this one here, notice an issue. 0.199 inches, but this one was millimeters. Well, my default units are inches, and so when it created a new session, it defaulted to the default units, which was inches. But I'm about ready to type in my measurement. I don't want to switch right now because it would cancel out of my fillet command. So instead, I'm going to come in here and type in 8. And notice if I type in 8, it's going to do 8 inches. But if I type in mm right next to it, it's going to do an 8 millimeter fillet, even though I'm in inches. So you can always type in different units if necessary. I also want to fillet these two edges here. So I'm going to do a selection set. Kind of keep my fillets all together. So I'm going to say let's do that edge and that edge, and I want these to be 3 mm, and so you can kind of see what that's going to look like. So hopefully that's a new tip. If you didn't know that already, you can type in different units even though you're in a totally different unit there. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK, and I'll come in and say, you know what, I do want to be in millimeters. I'll say OK. And those fillets are still correct. If I edit those, you can still see 8 and 3. It's kind of, let me turn to my camera real quick. Here's the back of the part. You can kind of see inside the back of the part. So, whoops, dropped it. We just created, you know, this fillet here and those two little side fillets. Now we're going to kind of shell this thing out so we have room for the nail or the screw to come through that key slot. So sorry about if that was noisy when I dropped it. So I'm going to rotate to the back here, pre-select this face, right mouse click, and it shows me the commands that make sense. Well, one of them is shell. So I'm going to go ahead and click on shell, and notice what happened. Well, tangent chain is turned on. So I selected this face, and with tangent chain turned on, it's going to say, is there any other face tangent to it? Well, yes, this fillet is. Is there any faces tangent to that? Well, yes, this flat face. So I'm going to turn that off, but nothing really changed. So I'm going to clear my selection and then click on that face. And now you'll notice with tangent chain turned off, it does not go all the way around. I want to have a fairly thick, I'm going to say like 4 millimeters. So I type in 4, and you can see it's going to shell to the inside. Now here's a tip. You know, because I did these fillets, those are going to carry over into the shell. So I usually make sure I have my fillets done before I do my shell. In fact, shell is one of the later downstream commands that I do. I usually have my part looking the way I want, and then I'll finally do the shell. That way I have even wall thickness all the way through. And I'll say OK, and we've just created that hollow part. So the last thing is to create that keyhole. And if I kind of see the shape there, if you kind of look at it, it sort of looks like a slot with a larger hole. Now there's probably multiple ways we can go about creating that, but let me go ahead and I'll create a sketch on this face, and I'm going to use the slot command. And I'll just do a center to center slot. Now I'm going to purposely kind of draw it at a weird angle. I'm not worrying about the size of it right now. I'm just kind of throwing it on the screen. Now, why did I do it at such a weird angle? Me personally, I like to add the constraints and see the change happen. So obviously I'm going to come in here and say I want that to be vertical. It's going to make that line vertical, and I can see that physically happen. First thing I'm going to do, though, is let's go ahead and make sure this is the right size. And notice when I click on dimension, it's doing a radius. Well, I want to specify the diameter of the slot. So I'm going to just right mouse click, and notice there's a pull down for diameter. I can specify, is it a radius or is it diameter? So I'll click on diameter, place my dimension, and I want this to be 4 millimeters, and we'll see that that instantly updated. Then, like I said, I'll come in here and say horizontal vertical. I'll click on that line there, and I can see that it turned vertical, but I can also see that it's not perfectly lined up with the origin. So I want to make sure that this point and this point are horizontally lined up with each other. So I just constrained that, and you can see some of this is starting to turn from blue to black, meaning that it's constrained. Okay, then I'm gonna tie down like dimensions. So let's go ahead and say for the length of the slot, I want this to be 12. And then for the position of it, I want it to be a certain location from there. And let's make that 6 millimeters. And now we can see that that is fully constrained. But what about the larger part for the screw head to go through? Well, I'm going to do something kind of different. Some people might say, well, I would just draw a bigger circle right here. Well, I'm going to delete these two tangent constraints, like so. And now you'll notice, obviously, things have changed. It's no longer fully constrained because we removed some of those constraints. And then I'm going to add a dimension to this bottom arc. Again, I want it to be a diameter, so I'm going to switch to diameter. Let's just place it maybe down here, and instead of 4, I want this to be 9. Now, I got kind of an interesting result here. You'll notice that arc right there. I'm going to go ahead and grab this point, and you can see if I move that around what is happening to my sketch. Okay. So obviously I need to make these lines be vertical. So let me go ahead and say I want that to be vertical. And let me change this real quick. Okay, I guess I need to do this before I make it vertical. There we go. So I'm going to bring, there we go. This is what I meant to do. I'm sorry. So I'm dragging this point up, and you can actually see how it's kind of updating that circle. I'll do the same thing here, kind of like so. And then I'll finally come in and say, I want this to be vertical. And there we go. So, and my dimension kind of moved off here a little bit. I made this a 9 diameter arc. And then I had to kind of manually drag that arc to kind of define the shape, and then finally finished constraining it with a vertical constraint. Now I could have just left the slot as it was, drawn a 9mm circle, but then I would have to do some trimming, or I'd have overlapping loops or whatever. I think this looks a little bit cleaner. So I'm going to go ahead and finish my sketch. We'll use this as the profile. Extrude. I'm going to kind of turn to the back side here. How far do I want it to extrude? I'm going to say to object, click on that face there, because I always want that keyhole to go all the way through. So if I were to change my shell to 5mm, this is still always going to go through because it's going to go to that face there. If I had just typed in a distance of 4mm, because that's what the wall thickness was, if I were to make a change, it would not go all the way through. So kind of keep that in mind. I'm going to admit, back in the day, I used to always do distance, or I would always click on the face. And it wasn't until some people pointed out, you should go to to object, and it's always going to reference that face. So I use to object a lot now. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK. And there we go. We are done with this part. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to call this mount with keyhole. And if we look at my project here, you can see there's the mount, and there's the mount with the keyhole. So where does this derive come into play? So check this out. I'm going to come back to here, and as I'm looking at this, I'm like, you know what? I want to add some character, because this face is going to be the visible face. In fact, this is kind of how it sits on the wall. These little faces here sit against the wall. The metal and the LEDs are kind of away from the wall, so it kind of casts a bigger glow. That's kind of the design. So I want to maybe round over, or maybe even chamfer, because I'm going to be 3D printing this. Chamfers 3D print better than fillets. And I learned that from Jason's last live stream. So if you didn't watch his last live stream, make sure you watch it. He had some really cool tips on 3D printing. So I'm going to select that edge and hit chamfer. And let's do maybe like a 2mm chamfer. Actually, that looks pretty cool. That might even catch some light and stuff like that and reflect it. I'm going to save this. I'll go ahead and hit save. I can even, say added 2mm chamfer. Now I'm going to go back to this mount over here. And notice no chamfer. But also notice in the timeline and up here at the top, it says one component is out of date. Click here to update it. So I'm just going to click on that little icon. And there is the chamfer that came from the original model. So it kept all of my changes that I did, but it was able to add that on there. And that's kind of the idea of Derive. You start with a model like this. If you come back and make some slight changes to it, so we say that's too big, let's make that 1. I save that. It is always going to communicate with the derived file and say, hey, that's out of date. I click on it, and it will update to that smaller chamfer. So this is kind of a cool example, I thought, where I have a part, they're sort of similar. I was able to reuse that existing model instead of starting from scratch and drawing a bunch of sketches. I just kind of deleted some features and then added the new features that I wanted, and it captured those new features in the timeline. Here's all those steps. Well, here's another quick example. I know we're kind of running short on time here. Here's another quick example. I can actually create a sketch and derive a sketch. So I'm just going to do a really basic one here. I'll just do a circle and maybe some kind of a rectangle. Okay, so I'll just do something like that. I'll finish that sketch. And I'm going to say create a derive. So notice when I do that, it says it requires a saved source. So I'm going to click on save and continue. And I'm going to call this main sketch, like so. It's going to save it into my project. What do I want to capture? So this time I'm going to say derive objects. And I'll go ahead and grab this sketch right here. And it could be multiple sketches. So you can kind of think of this almost like a template sketch. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK. And now it's in this new design. And let's say, for example, I already had some existing geometry. Let's just say a big box like so. I'll just do something like that, for example. So here's that sketch. And I'm going to use this sketch. I'll go ahead and extrude that down into the part, whatever distance, minus 0.5. Okay, and we'll save this guy, and I'll call this cool block. Now I can come back to my main sketch over here and make a change to it, right? So I'll come in and edit this sketch. Maybe it looks more like this. Maybe the circle is bigger, and I save that guy. Or I could obviously type in dimensions and all that kind of stuff. I'll come over to this cool block, and you'll notice I get the little warning saying things are out of date. So I'll go ahead and click on that, and it's going to actually use that sketch to make changes to my design. So it's not just models that you can derive. You can also do, for example, like sketches. So I got to thinking, like, maybe you do a lot of like sheet metal stamping or something like that. You could have these stamps as sketches, right? And you save those and you derive those into your design. And then maybe you decide, okay, those slots that we made need to be a little bit larger. So you go back and you update that sketch. And then those derived parts will update also, instead of having to recreate a pattern, change dimensions and sketches, etc. So kind of think about how you could go about using this. So I'm going to pause for a second, take a look. Hopefully Jason was able to answer a lot of the questions. Okay, yeah, it looks like he has been. So thank you, Jason, very much for doing that. Okay, so somebody asked, in which direction do you suggest to 3D print the derived part with the big void? I'm assuming you're talking about this part here. So I can tell you, I'll show you, this obviously I printed face down, so this was on the bed. And this I actually printed the exact same way, that was on the bed. And I just had support material in here. Now I have my 3D printer dialed in pretty darn good with support material that I was able to pull out of there. I doubt my camera is going to focus very good. So you can see there's a little bit of a rough surface in there, but it's quite smooth inside. So spend some time playing around with the support material settings and stuff, and you'll get some, literally just kind of pulled right out. So yeah, is there a better direction? I don't know. I ended up printing it the exact same way because I wanted this face to be really smooth, because that's what's visible, because this is against the wall and then this is what's visible. So, oops, I'm looking at the camera and not showing, sorry. So I wanted this face to be very smooth. So obviously I put that on the bed. And then this is the face that goes against the wall. So good question. So Robert asked, when's the next cam? I don't know. Like I said, Angelo is actually in Las Vegas helping out at BattleBots, helping manufacture parts and stuff. I guess he's been crazy busy there, so probably hasn't had a lot of time to prep for a cam session. So I'll bet you next Thursday we'll probably do another modeling session, and then we'll get him back into the rotation once he's recovered. So he's also been very, very busy this summer, and that's kind of why we stopped doing the live streams for a while. So with that, I want to thank everybody for attending. It looks like we had a really good turnout. I was afraid we'd get like maybe 3 people since we haven't done this for so long. So I do appreciate the loyalty of all of you, and hope you learned some new stuff. I noticed Jason was putting some links out there. Definitely recommend following him on our 360 Live channel also. And if you have any ideas, add them into the comments. Future things you want to see, like cam or surfacing or whatever it might be. So with that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and happy fusioning.